All right, hello everybody. This is Antonio Wolf. It has been a while since I've made a video. Actually, no, it's not been that much. It's barely been like what, a month, 4 weeks, 3 weeks since we finished the trial. But I mean, that was a different type of video. Anyways, I've been wanting to actually do this for quite a while. Just like we did a general discussion on freedom half a year ago, almost, I think. That was pretty interesting. That went into quite a bit of detail on many things. I want to be doing one on Hegel's concept of a God, because it's a pretty contentious concept, even among Hegelians nowadays. I mean, we have most of the popular readings are atheistic, properly speaking, in that even though they kind of go, yeah, Hegel talks about God, but what he really means isn't a supernatural entity. It's actually very naturalist friendly. No magic, no miracles, and it's just really about the absoluteness of reason. That we as human beings come together as a community, and also our thinking. And it's just a sort of self-grounded thing, but there isn't actually a God out there in the world that's controlling everything and creating destiny or guiding history. All things which Hegel does say, by the way, and I mean he does say that there is indeed a God in the world who's controlling history and guiding destinies, but that's just metaphorical. Not very often heard is indeed this position, which is a position I've come to over the long years, and slowly thinking about this, that God is not simply this process of being. It's not simply Aristotle's God, which is just this disinterested, unmoving mover that just gets everything else into motion, but doesn't have a personality, doesn't have a will, doesn't have any plans, and doesn't relate to us on that level. Even people like, say, Robert Wallace, who is very theologically friendly, I suppose, even to Christianity, doesn't really have a view of God as somebody that's a person, that you can't talk to God. And it's not that Hegel says that we could talk to God either. There's that famous phrase from Hegel that the morning newspaper is the modern secular man's a prayer. And some people, particularly the atheist readers, interpret that as saying, oh, well, for Hegel, God is society, the social community. Therefore, obviously, the analogy to prayer, that with prayer you communicate with God. Well, with the newspaper, you're communicating with God. It's like, what is it? I don't think has like an original person, or if there was, we don't know who it was. The one that says, prayer is not actually you talking to God. Prayer is you listening for what God has to say. Well, I mean, newspapers is how you basically find out what society's telling you. What, the state lets you know what's going on through the newspaper. God speaks to you through that, which is exactly the analogy Hegel intends. But it's not supposed to be, a supplanting of that. So anyways, yeah.
Don't forget about me, William Desmond from Cork, Ireland.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's really unfortunate.
I haven't read that book.
It seems to me textually uninformed, the way people will dismiss Hegel's discussions of God, or his constant mentioning and identification of the idea with God and so on, because he does this constantly everywhere, where it's treated as metaphor. But then it is completely ignored where Hegel explicitly says things like absolute spirit creates nature. He says that in the introduction to the philosophy of spirit, and he says it in other places as well. And you'll see people like Brandom and stuff like that. It's like it's like the individual like institutions, society forms your triad or whatever. Does he think those things create nature, like the universe? Because Hegel says absolute spirit is the creator of nature, and so the people who dismiss it as metaphor just they aren't connecting the text with his discussions of religion in general.
Yeah, and you have actually a lot of quotes that show this. Actually, let me see if I can find some. Some of them are really, really good.
Like he says it so much. Here's a quick one. God alone is the genuine agreement between concept and reality. All finite things, however, are affected with untruth. They have a concept, but their existence is not adequate to it. For this reason, they must go to the ground, and this manifests the inadequacy between their concept and their existence. He's not saying they don't exist. He's saying they literally manifest their own inadequacy. That's their being there. The animal is something singular, has its concept and its kind, and the kind frees itself from singularity through death. He has way stronger quotes than that, though. But it just things like that are peppered all over the place throughout his work.
Yeah. Where is the... Got a little thread with some of your stuff.
Oh, here's a good one. Human reason. The consciousness of one's being is indeed reason. It is the divine in man, and spirit, insofar as it is the spirit of God, is not a spirit beyond the stars, beyond the world. On the contrary, God is present, omnipresent, and exists as spirit in all spirits. God is a living God who is acting and working. Religion is a product of the divine spirit. It is not a discovery of man, but a work of divine operation and creation in him. He literally attributes God omnipresence, is spirit in all spirits. So he's like the indwells within everyone, and is a living and acting and working God that is efficacious in the world, and that religion is not something that people just make up, but is a result of basically them intuiting the divinity that is operating within them, and that enables them to be thinking beings and things like that. Like literally, like you, by thinking and stuff like that, you're tracing out a divine path towards knowledge of God, basically, and it's God himself who generates and produces the path on which you walk to return to him or stray.
Yeah. The atheistic reading of Hegel's God, that it's just community, is basically the reading which thinks that Hegel's system really stops at objective spirit. That is the actual end. And as a matter of fact, there are a few of the modern interpreters that basically say that. Who is it that particularly I have in mind? Maybe it's Pippin, maybe it's Brandom. Like one of these two literally says that they think that the objective spirit part is where the system should have ended. Probably it's Brandon, because Brandon focuses on the phenomenology of spirit, and so I think that he's of the interpretation that after the section on spirit, he thinks that the section of religion is not really essential, and that should have been where it ended. Don't quote me on that; I'm not entirely sure, but somebody
that's
says
basically
that.
how people interpret it. They get up to history, but they don't understand the world spirit, and it's baffling because second, where's my copy? It's baffling because Hegel will say the most direct things. The transition. Okay, so once we get past the end of objective spirit, we get into absolute spirit in the philosophy of spirit. He says the absolute mind is identity, both an identity that is eternally within itself and an identity that returns and has returned into itself. the one and universal substance as spiritual, the judgment discerning itself into itself, and an awareness for which the substance is as such. Religion, as the supreme sphere, in general, can be designated, is to be regarded as issuing from the subject and situated in the subject, but is equally regarded as objectively issuing from the absolute spirit, which as spirit is in its community. He's not saying it's issuing from the community. He's saying it's issuing from the absolute spirit, which as spirit, because you are spirit, is in its community. He's saying, saying God communes with himself in community. That's not... again, there's a displacement there. It's not just coming from you.
Yeah, let me see. There's a quote here about the state and God. It says, of course, the state is essentially worldly and finite. It has particular ends and particular powers, but its worldly character is only one of its aspects, and it is only to an unintelligent superficial glance that it is finite and nothing more. For the state has a life-giving soul, and the soul which animates it is subjectivity, which creates differences and yet at the same time holds them together in unity. In the realm of religion, too, there are distinctions and limitations. God, it is said, is triune. Thus, there are three persons whose unity alone is spirit. Therefore, to apprehend the nature of God concretely is to apprehend it through distinctions alone. Hence, in the kingdom of God, there are limitations, just as there are in the world, and to hold that mind on earth, that is, the state, is only a finite mind, is a one-sided view, since there is nothing irrational about actuality. Of course, a bad state is worldly and finite and nothing else, but the rational state is inherently infinite. And, I mean, this is just related to, the quote, I think, where Hegel says, the state is God's march upon the earth, and a lot of people go, oh, Hegel's glorifying, the existent state. Well, no, he's glorifying the idea of the state, which is eternal. It's not any singular finite state. I mean, every singular finite state is an existent manifestation of this idea. But, as he says there, a state being only finite in the world, can be erroneous, can have problems with it, but, that's just an empirical state. That doesn't disprove anything about the idea of the state. And the state is only one partial manifestation of what God is.
Yeah.
So, for some reason, Discord does not allow me to search while I'm streaming. Weird.
Oh, weird.
Because usually I had a window of yours open with all the history of your quotes.
There's a...
But okay.
I'll gotta find it. There's one really good one where he's very, very explicit. And it also is contrary to the kind of historicism that people like to attribute to Hegel.
Oh yeah, people who think that history is just this contingent thing, and so in fact, this betrays the very concept of history for Hegel, that history has a definite beginning and also a definite end, and this has nothing to do with the empirical passage of time. It's about the structure of what history is supposed to be for. World history writ large for Hegel is how freedom comes to be in a state. It's not about temporal history at all. Doesn't matter if it's 1,000 years or 100.
Yeah, the argument about, or it's a self-refuting argument, the historicist argument, because history itself is a trans-historical concept, because the concept of history is that through which history manifests and is recognizable as manifesting and is intelligible, and that applies to anything in history at any time. It is only because the concept of history is itself trans-historical that history is even recognizable. Otherwise, you'd be in this position of being like, okay, I can't have an eternal truth because we are historical. Philosophy is utterly limited by finite historical situatedness. But that's a claim that applies to all time. Basically, it says, yeah, and so it's refuting itself, because otherwise there'd be a chance that you could historically revise, like through the process of history, you could revise the concept of history, and you could wind up with an eternal concept of history. Like, you couldn't bar that possibility from within the historicist vantage point. And if they did bar that possibility, which is what you're supposed to do, because you're saying my knowledge is contingent and historical, you're making an absolute claim. You're saying this is absolutely true for all time, that knowledge is historical, finite, situated. And so it's an absolute claim when you're supposed to be denying the ability to make absolute claims. So the very concept of history has to be transhistorical. Yeah.
Yeah, there's that. What is it? I know you posted the quote before, literally the end, the very last quote set of paragraphs in the encyclopedia. The one where he mentions that God is the idea, like, on its own, separate from everything else, which breaks this notion that people have. And he said specifically it's separate even, from nature and the manifestation of spirit, that, that people have this notion that God somehow is dependent on us, finite individuals in some way. Which Hegel does, actually, not just in that place, but in various places. He does deny. For God is the object of God. The fact that the world exists, Hegel says it's just a free action. It's not a necessary action. It's not that God needs the world of nature to exist. It is itself a free existent. Quite literally by, what's that word? By the grace of God. Man, it's so weird that I can't search this up on Discord, because you had a lot of these codes. But anyways, I mean, that's just the basic gist of it. That the notion that you got it?
Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So just the gist of that is just that the notion that Hegel is an atheist is really bizarre. The notion that Hegel's God could be reduced simply to this impersonal process is also just plain wrong. It doesn't make any sense when you even think about it. Even if Hegel had not said anything about this, his own logic has to commit you to the view that God is. It's an odd thing to say. They are a person necessarily, because God has to be existent, but they are also more strongly the person, such that the totality as totality has to, in being an object of its own cognition, has to be existent within itself as a perfect mirror structure. The totality as totality is reflected within itself as an existent form of that totality. The atheist readers want to take it that this can only mean that we are that reflection, and indeed we are, but we are so only in a limited form. When we think, only have access to the idea of logic, the logical idea, whereas, which is just simply the logic of the concept, but not yet the full blown idea, where to conceive, to conceptualize, is to have the object itself. God has intellectual intuition. We don't. God thinks a tree, and the tree forms itself before the eyes of God, so to say. Whereas we think a tree, and it's only a representation in our imagination. And, if we want to engage the process of the creation of a tree, we ourselves don't make a tree. We don't provide the soul. We can barely provide the soil, the water, the nutrients. And, we can't make a plant out of nothing. The plant has to already be there, and we can only engage its own process, but we can't make that process. Whereas God's intellection is the making of that process itself, or rather the being of that process of a plant, for example. So in that, not only does God have to be able to cognize themselves, have themselves as their own object, to be for themselves, as part of the meaning of absoluteness, of the meaning of what it is to be ultimately. That has to also involve consciousness, because if you get to the point where you say, well, reality is absolute, but it reaches a point of consciousness where consciousness only has access to the concept, but not really to the object. And so all that we can do is make these finite adjustments where, we can poke things here and there, figure out how they work, but we can't really make reality. And I know you had a quote on this, which is I was hoping to find, but I can't because it doesn't let me search right now, where he specifically mentions this, and he says it is a mistake to think that the idea could only have a retroactive power to accept itself, that reason could be absolute, and that its absoluteness is literally limited to simply recognizing, oh, well, by the train of logic, I must have been the one, reason must have been the one to posit the world retroactively, that, mind therefore becomes the condition of nature. But Hegel specifically brings up that this is still only finite perspective because the concept and the object are still dirempted for us. We can only cognize the concept, but we don't cognize objects as such, or rather, we don't in our thinking we don't make them. And he says this cannot be the case. Spirit, mind, has to indeed be absolute. It cannot just be a retroactive conception and a kind of stoic acceptance of the way things are, simply because retroactively reason forces me to accept that this is how things would be posited if I could understand how I posited it, despite the fact that I haven't consciously done it. This would leave the world to just be an unconscious mess that afterwards you kind of go through and you recognize, oh, well, that's how the way things were always were, and you just reason reconciles you to that. But no, God has to also be the one. The idea really has to posit nature of its own account freely, and not only retroactively recognize that in a logical sense, in a merely logical sense, that one has to understand that nature is grounded in it. But for us, with our finite cognition, even with our own, the immense power of societies, where we have a distributed power of knowledge, where different people know different things and have the capacity to actually engage different objective processes, from technology, from farming to all these other things. All of those do not posit the world as such. All of those are only merely modifications of the world that already is there. But the idea really is the self-positing of itself and of the natural world. And this has to therefore involve personality, has to involve a consciousness and a will, because a thing cannot God could not posit the world unknowingly, then retroactively see it knowingly, but in that knowing not be capable to actually posit it again. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. The section you're talking about is from the Introduction to the Philosophy of Mind, section 384. It's where he discusses basically the nature of subjective, objective, and absolute mind. And in that, objective mind is exactly the one most people are thinking of when they think of Hegel, where again, it's like a recollective understanding, but nonetheless, the world is still just something that's just completely independent of mind. But he says it's not yet absolute mind because we're still encountering a limitation. And I think I can just read it out here. So here mind posits nature as something reflected into itself, as its world, strips nature of its form of another, confronts it, and makes the other opposing it into something posited by mind itself. But at the same time, this other still remains independent of mind, something immediately present, not posited, but only presupposed by mind, something, therefore, the positing of which precedes reflective thinking. Hence, at this standpoint, the positedness of nature by mind is not yet absolute, but comes about only in reflective consciousness. Nature is therefore not yet comprehended as subsisting only through infinite mind as its creation. Like,
Yep.
he can't be more clear. He's like, we're not talking about having a representation or like a copy of the world, like a model in your head, And like when you have a good model, there you go. It's about knowledge of the nature of God through which the world is even attaining and constructing itself. And your access to that is your specific will. Like you can't make other things do other things, but you can make yourself do things. And as a self-conscious person, your thinking and your willing can be simultaneous. Like you can lift your arm up volitionally. That is a direct manifestation of that power through you specifically. That's the individuation and the self-differentiation of God through which things are pausing themselves. He's like the source of freedom through which things freely become what they are and can destroy themselves or return to God and stuff like that, or can become aware of that of God through which they are pausing and producing themselves, and hence be united with God in their own being in the world.
Yeah, I think I think I found one of these.
And there's another good one. This is against the anti-historic, or against the historicist interpretation, where in the copy of his Introduction to the Philosophy of Religion on Marxist.org, Section 3, Revealed Religion, it says, manifestation, development, and determination or specification do not go on ad infinitum, and do not cease accidentally. True progress consists rather in this, that this reflection of the notion into itself stops short, inasmuch as it really returns into itself. Thus manifestation is itself infinite in nature. The content is in accordance with the conception of spirit, and the manifestation is, like spirit, in and for itself. The notion or conception of religion has in religion become objective to itself. Spirit, which is in and for itself, has now no longer individual forms, determinations of itself before it as it unfolds itself. It knows itself no longer as spirit in any definite form or limitation, but now has overcome those limitations, this finiteness, and is actually what it is potentially. This knowledge of spirit for itself, or actually, as it is in itself, or potentially, is the being in and for itself of spirit as exercising knowledge, the perfect absolute religion, in which it is revealed with spirit what God is. This is the Christian religion.
Indeed, indeed. So, I mean, I'm not going to get into the weeds of, whether Hegel's God actually has to forcefully, logically commit you to the Christian God. Because I do think there is a sense in which it does and a sense in which it doesn't. I mean, I think the only general thing I'm going to say about that is that insofar as one thinks that Christianity and religions as they have appeared in general are things that are fit for their age and have a historical sell-by date, then I could believe that, yeah, maybe another religion comes about after Christianity. And I mean, and there always are religions. There's never been a time really where I would say that in human historical terms, as like modern human beings, with the self-conscious that we have, there wasn't religion. Even people who supposedly don't believe in God still have religion. They just don't conceive it in the same way, but they still have the structures of it, and they still have the structures of some kind of absolute, which is just what God is, anyways, in the strongest sense. So, insofar as Hegel makes the case, and I think he does make a good case, that the conceptual structure of Christianity is the conceptual structure of truth, what he calls the concept of the idea, where he talks about various things like the truth of incarnation, the truth of the origin of the world, the truth of the sinful nature of man, the meaning of the crucifixion, the meaning of the Trinity, insofar as those are the main logical aspects that he deals with, and not so much any historical things about, is Jesus really a historical person or not? Did he really have godlike powers or not? Supernatural powers. Hegel does talk about those things, but it seems that even for him, they weren't quite what mattered. He has a few passages, which I know somebody has mentioned in the Absolute Idealism server about miracles. Where he mentions logically speaking, miracles have to be possible. Why not? I mean, God is truly omnipotent. There is no reason why nature should provide any barrier whatsoever for spirit doing anything it posits. So, God wants to heal somebody and skip the laws of requiring a certain amount of time and all these other things. God can do it. And indeed, the very way nature works, as far as Hegel's concerned, Hegel thinks nature is literally broken, that it's not fully connected in itself. It's irrational in that way, and one may connect that to ideas of magic, which for Hegel, magic is simply the immediate action which is not mediated by natural circumstances. So, spirit upon spirit, thought is literally, he says thought or spirit mind is literally the most magical thing possible. It is pure magic. It has no mediations. It's immediately with itself, immediately distinguishes itself, brings itself back into unity. There's no time, there's no space, which would impede it. And in nature, you have things which may seem like freak accidents of nature, may seem like interruptions of the natural flow. And then one can perhaps at some point find things that may explain anything that looks miraculous and find out that, oh, well, really what was going on is some kind of engagement of some natural powers or force. But all in all, Hegel doesn't care about these. They don't prove anything empirically speaking. He has even a thing where he says that the miracles are kind of for stupid people. That if you need a miracle to believe in divinity, to believe in God, you're kind of not really aware of what God is. He basically says that I suppose he's drawing this from his own interpretation, which is also one I share, of the whole thing. Blessed are those who believe without seeing, and seeing in the empirical sense, in the senses kind of sense. Because there's a second form of seeing, which is the intellectual sense, and that's the one that matters.
Yeah. Yeah, he says miracles should not serve as any basis for one's religion or belief in God. It's antithetical to the nature of spirit.
Yeah, I think he might also play around there with it's in the Christian Bible as well. The devil can perform miracles too, so a miracle proves nothing. I think Hegel does provide good arguments for why Christianity is logically the highest and final religion, historically speaking, empirically speaking. I can also believe that maybe another religion will come. But insofar as another religion will come,
it doesn't do away with what we've already done.
It cannot really be essentially different to Christianity in the end, if there is a new religion. Because if it is, it would only be a retrogression rather than a progression. Because at least what may be a problem with Christianity, as people might see it, is that in order for you to get the truth in Hegel's sense, you got to really think about it. I mean, it took about 2,000 or so years for an understanding to come about, which started to make sense of really weird things that, as far as the understanding went, just didn't quite square in the Bible. The Trinity was something that was and still actually remains contentious in Christianity. Even those who accept it can't normally explain it. Stuff like the incarnation is a huge thing. People come debates about, was Jesus half human, half God? Was he fully human, fully God? Was he only a man? Was he really just fully God and not really a man? Because there's a whole bunch of stuff that gets entailed in that. all those things are just not clear in the text of the Bible itself. So
no, but there is clear stuff.
Yeah, there are clear things. So it takes philosophical reflection quite a long while to suss out a lot of that from it, and provide a rational presentation of it. So perhaps a religion might come about later that basically takes this essence and presents it a bit more rationally, one may say.
Concrete.
Although more concretely, because when I say rationally, I don't mean that they're going to be making philosophical arguments, because I think, as far as Hegel's concerned, a religion that is based around philosophical arguments cannot be a religion at all, because it's not really tapping into what religion is really strong with, which is the element of faith, which is this inward conviction, not just in any singular belief, but it's literally the inward conviction of reality itself. That somebody who truly has faith in God, this isn't something baseless, as opposed to the regular notions people have about faith, which is like, faith is believing without evidence. People who have faith are really stupid because they don't have any reason to believe. I mean, that's empirically a stupid claim to begin with. I admit that there was a time in which, for a couple of years when I first became a new atheist, I believed this, and then I myself realized in the short term that this is a stupid notion that nobody believes for no fucking reason. But the main reason for faith is just this inward certainty of the absolute reality, which is connected with the personal connection with God. So it's not a belief in some kind of historical fact. It's not a belief in some contingent fact. Most people who have faith don't really have faith in a rational form, but faith itself is rational insofar as it is the intuition of the necessity of reality itself. When you don't have faith, I mean, you're literally having an existential crisis. That is really what it is to lose faith in general, not simply just faith in religion. I mean, a crisis of faith happens both in things that we recognize as religion, but it happens with just about anything else. You can have a scientist who has a crisis of faith in science, or somebody who sees something that breaks their notion of what reality is, or experiences things that break their notion of what reality is, and if they don't find some way to reintegrate that in some kind of coherent way, whether it be new or back into the old, just fucks you up.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that people struggle to recognize how there's a sense in which one's constant act of self-regulating, of interpreting things and trying to kind of have a cohesive sense of how things hang together, and how that permeates everything that they do, and right down to your emotional responses, right down to people have personal crises in their lives and stuff like that all the time, and it's because your conviction in reality has been challenged, and that's actually the thing that kind of keeps you together. But that's the same sense of self-reflexive verification of itself. That process is the thing that's being challenged in all sorts of different experiences that happen in people's lives.
Yeah.
Structure that is presupposed by all of these sorts of things that they do, and how that there's continuity in those structures.
Yeah, I mean, in the lectures on the proofs of God, it begins with a set of lectures on faith and knowledge, in which Hegel sets it up. He says the usual dichotomy people have between faith and knowledge is completely false. Faith is knowledge. It's just the sheer immediacy of knowledge. It's just the sheer certainty of reality, without any further determination. It's just indeterminate in that way. And then knowledge, as we recognize it normally, is not something different to this. Whereas faith is immediate knowledge, knowledge as we normally think it is mediated. But these two are ultimately not antithetical. Hegel brings up the obvious. Once you think about it, once he points it out, he says, well, literally all knowledge begins with faith. If you didn't have the certainty that there was something there in the first place, there'd be nothing for you to do and nothing for you to interact and nothing for you to think. So, insofar as you think that there's anything to know at all, the first step of knowing is to have faith that there is anything at all. He says this in the Phenomenology of Spirit as well. He says, if you don't have, there is a step of faith. He says, in order for us to engage in this inquiry into the absolute, obviously we have to have a faith that there is an absolute.
Yeah.
And he says, because if we didn't, we wouldn't be doing philosophy in the first place, now would we? We wouldn't be doing all these other things that we do, because then we just wouldn't have any impetus to do anything. So faith is just the immediate beginning. But from that immediate beginning, there's already the drive that, in faith, and I mean, this is what a lot of the early church fathers, even themselves, talked about. They didn't see a difference between faith and knowledge. They thought that faith and knowledge were completely tied. That if you have faith in God, of course you want to know God. There's a desire in you to know God because you believe there is a God. And so faith itself draws you to learn, draws you to get knowledge of God, which is part of what ends up historically being extremely, extremely significant in Christianity. Can't say much about Islam because I'm not real studied on that. I know very vague things. But definitely in Christianity, this drive of faith that leads to genuine knowledge of the world is indeed hugely, hugely inspired by this belief that faith and knowledge are one. If you have faith, faith is what draws you to want to know more about God, know more of God, because you want to obey God, you want to know what God's will is. But in order to do that, you also have to know what the world is, because God created the world. You're put in the world. You're put in the world to do certain things, and you need knowledge to do certain things. So it has a general drive to know everything, because everything gets implicated into God ultimately. So the very drive towards secularity is already there in these very early notions of Christianity, which are indeed not unique to Christianity, I must say. This is already, you can tell that it's already an implication within the Jewish tradition as well. I mean, Jews are very, very careful with knowledge, partly because it is also an aspect of the religion, because, God is this strict God, has strict rules, and, you want to keep on the good side of the boss. So, you better find out exactly what the boss wants and, what the boss rules are. So, I mean, that's a bit of a religious historical tangent.
It's unfortunate that people don't understand the ways in which they have faith. And like one thing that I see with a lot of philosophers is they'll think it somehow makes sense to provide a purely negative argument, where it's like there will be some position put forth positively and they will negate that position. But what they don't attend to is the way in which that negation has its basis on something they are positing, through which they identify that thing as illegitimate. And so it can appear to them that they're not making, they don't have a presupposition at play in how they critique the things they're engaged with. And so it can appear to them that there's like a lot of things that you can just be skeptical of or something like that. But they don't understand how the way in which they engage that skepticism of different things is itself a non-skeptical standpoint, which is making an assertion of some sort through which they are identifying and negating things. Because if they did, their whole position would look very different. So you get a lot of people in philosophy that can't recognize the way in which they're deploying a faith because they're not even self-conscious of their faith, I guess, in the act of what they're doing. Faith is like the presupposition, basically, but it's a presupposition that can't not be made. And so it's not about it's about recovering what goes into the presupposition that is present in the faith that one is immediately endowed with. Recovering how is it that they had faith in the first place comes to be ceases to be faith eventually. It becomes truth.
It's kind of like, in a quite literal sense, we're forced to engage with the world meaningfully. We're forced to engage with meaning as if it's meaningful. And we can't avoid that.
Yeah, what was it that you told me that's kind of what ends up happening with the skeptics, like the actual like hardcore skeptics, like Pyrrhonians, that they end up denying that there is meaning to anything, so they just really cease engaging because they can't by their own viewpoint.
Yeah, it can be a pathology. Some are pretty relaxed, but there was one time I was talking to basically a Pyrrhonist of some sort, and I outlined the sort of world. If one takes Pyrrhonism really seriously, I don't think it's relaxing at all. I outlined like the violence of the position, what it is like to not actually take people seriously, to take the claims people make seriously, to take other people seriously. Basically, because it is genuinely a negative position. If you don't believe anything, or at least purport not to believe anything, you must actively, if you're serious about this, not be taking other people seriously. You must be completely alienated from everything that goes on around you. And I was discussing all these different effects that comes from what happens if you're a serious Pyrrhonist, rather than somebody who just kind of like is a Pyrrhonist. How pathological it is, and how self-destructive it is, and how destructive it is to other people. And they broke down actually, because they were somebody who is, again, it turns into like a pathology. It's like a sickness of the soul if you're like a serious skeptic. And not a dogmatic skeptic in the sense of like somebody who like affirmatively denies the possibility of knowledge, but somebody who just simply cannot make sense of anything possibly being true or anything like that. Like if taken seriously, it should really ruin you personally, and for some people it does.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't say I've interacted with anybody except that one guy that came into our server once, like maybe a year and a half ago, if you remember. Like they claimed to be a Pyrrhonian skeptic, and they didn't seem to be like actually like good at doing the methodology. They kind of ended up having being unable, or not being unable, but like they were unwilling because they saw that they would immediately contradict themselves if they actually answered. They couldn't even answer like basic questions like, like, do you believe that there's communication at all? Because that would imply that there's meaning. And if there's meaning, that means that there's a definite mutual understanding. And then there's a question of, well, then if this is possible, how is it possible? It means that you have to actually know something, and you have to know it definitively. Even if you're not, or at least there has to be the possibility of knowing it definitively. And this person just ended up going in these circles, avoiding answering that question, because the moment you accept there actually is real communication, you're also accepting that there are things that are not going to be possible to rationally like pretend that you're going to question that they're real or not, or that you don't understand that they are or not.
Yeah.
But anyways, that aside, I suppose we can go over Hegel's general view of like the cosmological proofs. Well, not the cosmological, the proofs of God, the classical proofs of God. Cosmological proof, the theological proof, and the ontological proof. Because they're quite interesting. I actually intend to do a write-up of these. They're not as complex. I mean, it's a book of lectures, Hegel's Proofs of God. It's not that long of a set of lectures, but admittedly, most of the lectures don't have much to say of that's like really necessary detail. It's a lot of historical commentary and background and examples that sometimes are illuminating, sometimes not so illuminating. But the actual like set of lectures that go over the core of these are actually only about 5. With the cosmological proof having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lectures. Well, 4 lectures really, and there's the 5th lecture is a recapitulation of the other 4. And then theological proof has 1, and then the ontological proof also has 1, and then a second one, which is a different form of it. Well, it's a different lecture of the exact same lecture content. Interestingly, the main thing Hegel wants to bring up with these is that it was a proper thing that these were abandoned overall in the end philosophically because they were not properly true arguments in the way they were posed. So he ends up showing that there are inherent conceptual problems in the very assumptions of the way these arguments are posed. So that, he's not really a proponent. He does not propose the cosmological proof. He does not propose the teleological proof. And he does not propose the ontological proof. But out of all these 3, he then goes and shows you why he does not propose any of these, but why the rational force behind these is true. It was just not true in the way that they were put forth, in the way that they continue to be put forth to this very day. And of course, the one that really ends up hitting closest to home for Hegel is ultimately the teleological proof. Not the teleological proof, the ontological proof. The ontological proof, because it is a purely conceptual proof, where it's really just 3 concepts, and it's really 2 in the end when you actually think about it. It's just the concept of God as the highest being, the concept of existence, or rather, reality as something that could accumulate, and existence as itself, what is it called, a property or a predicate, and then being, or rather, existence and being are just kind of not really that different in the argument. And the only thing Hegel has to say about that one is like that the main problem is the assumption that there has to be a proof for the existence of God from his essence, their essence, is a ridiculous notion to begin with. Why would you even assume that there had to be a distinction in the first place? That you got to go from a conceptual essence to a concrete real existence. The very assumption that there is this distinction which leads to the requirement of this argument is itself erroneous, which is why this argument ultimately, in that it accepts this distinction, will not be convincing to anybody who also accepts this distinction, despite the fact that, rationally speaking, in its structure, it is completely valid, and there's nothing anybody can show that is wrong with it. Besides, the occasional attacks, like from someone like Kant, who says, existence is not a predicate.
W.
Yeah.
We missed the past couple minutes, and you stopped recording.
Hello.
We hear you, but the past 2 minutes or so, we didn't hear you, and you stopped recording, or at least from our end.
Oh, weird. Okay, well, the recording's still going on my end, so.
Okay, all right, good.
I was just talking about the general ontological proof issues that Hegel has, that it assumes that being and existence are distinct, that they are separate, that therefore you have to make existence a predicate or a property, and that you then have to prove that it depends necessarily to God. And that's Hegel's major problem with it. Besides that, the argument is frankly perfect. There's nothing wrong with it. Once you understand the definition of God, once you accept the definition of God is that in which nothing greater can be conceived. The argument that God has to exist in actuality, in the world, let's say, rather than just in my mind, naturally flows out of it. Because, and Anselm sets it out perfectly fine. He says, like, well, if you're the atheist and you say, well, okay, I accept the definition that God is that in which nothing greater can be conceived, that this is what the concept of God is. If I then go ahead and say, like, but, God is just merely a concept of my head, then you're contradicting yourself. Because you're saying that than which nothing greater can exist, I conceive as a limited thing of which something greater I can conceive to exist. Which is a whole bunch of nonsense.
Yeah. Most people reply with like sailors or the island, like constellators or like Guanalo's island and stuff like that. As though the argument was something you could just substitute anything in and it would work. Whereas the point is in the argument is that God's basically being defined as that which its concept and its existence are inseparable from one another. So anything where those are separable is deficient. So you can't actually, there's nothing to replace it. You can't choose a different example to try and like produce an ad absurdum or something like that. Because what you're doing is you're basically asserting something where its concept and its existence can depart, and saying that this disproves the existence of the thing where its concept and its existence do not depart from one another. So it's you can't substitute anything. They're like it. As far as I can tell, the argument basically the only thing it leaves you with is figuring out what that concept exactly is. Because it immediately identifies all that's insufficient with reference to it. So it basically sets you up with a task. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the basic gist of it. That it only works for God because God is that which is defined as that in which nothing greater can be conceived. Whereas an island is not defined as that in which nothing greater can be conceived. You can't just append and say, like, well, what if I conceive the greatest possible island? Well, sure, the greatest possible island may exist, but it's not in the essence of an island that it is that in which nothing greater can be conceived.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in general, Hegel actually does imply in a few places that he believes that he's basically done an ontological argument in a true sense, where the entirety of a system is basically a proof, one gigantic proof of the existence of God, which peaks with basically the philosophy of religion, which deals with the concept of God, still only as finitely represented, but the full thing peaks back again with the full logic, the idea of God. Except, the logic at the end of the system is not the logic at the beginning anymore. The logic at the beginning was merely conceptual, whereas the logic at the end is now understood to be truly conceptual and fully objective as well, fully realized in its concept. So the idea proper is not simply this definition in our heads.
Nice. Well put.
So let's see. There's actually a few forms of the argument, the cosmological argument. Here's one from contingency to necessity. It says the usual way that the syllogism of that argument is put forth is, quote, the contingent does not rest upon itself. Let me share my screen. Forgot about that. The contingent does not rest upon itself, but upon the presupposition of something that is within itself absolutely necessary, something that is its essence, ground, cause. But the world is contingent. The individual things of the world are contingent, and it is as a whole as the aggregate of these things. Therefore, the world presupposes something that is absolutely necessary within itself. The specific aspect from which this conclusion starts is the contingency of worldly things. If we take these things as we find them in sensation, representational thought, and if we compare what goes on in the human mind, we may indeed declare it to be an experience that worldly things taken by themselves are regarded as contingent. Individual things do not come from themselves or proceed by themselves. As contingent, they are destined to pass away. This is something that does not happen to them simply contingently, but is constitutive of their nature. Even if the course they follow is one that develops within them, is guided by rule and law, it goes on until it reaches their end, or rather leads only to their end. In like fashion, their existence is infringed upon by other things in all kinds of ways and brought to an end by external factors. If they are regarded as conditioned, then their conditions are things that exist independently outside of them, which may or may not correspond to them, and by which they may or may not be temporarily sustained. Initially, they are seen to be coordinated in space without being connected by any further relation that is part of their nature. The most heterogeneous elements are found side by side, and they can be separated without injury to each other's existence. Similarly, they follow one another externally in time. They are in fact finite, and however independent they may seem, they are essentially devoid of independence because of the limitations of their finitude. They are actual, but their actuality has the value merely of possibility. They are, but can equally well not be as be. So let's just go and explain the contingency of things and what the actual contingency of things implies. Like, if something is contingent, it means that it's conditioned by something else. But insofar as conditions are not that condition is not internal to it, the thing on its own is a mere possibility. It could be or it could not be by its very concept.
Yeah, an interesting thing that people will do is because they don't understand what contingency is, they'll think that you can just have contingency, like you just have it. Whereas the very nature of contingency is that it may be or may not be. And the very notion of contingency is itself a necessary kind of meaning. So thinking through the notion of contingency sublates it. There's a necessity that the meaning of contingency is that meaning. Otherwise, it could be any other meaning, and so it ceases to be just contingent.
The contingency is necessarily contingent.
Yeah, and but people don't catch that, so they think it's just like you can just have just contingency, and so they never can't move out of that. Everything just looks possible to them.
Yep, and I think that's where this heads in the next paragraph. He says, their existence discloses, however, not only connections between conditions, that is, dependencies, owing to which things come to be characterized as contingent, but also connections of cause and effect, the rule-governed behavior of their inner and outer course of action, laws. These dependencies, this conformity to law, raise worldly things above the category of contingency to necessity, and the latter thus appears within the sphere that we have thought of as occupied only by contingencies. Contingency claims things in virtue of their isolation or singularization. Therefore, they may equally exist or not exist, but they are just as much the opposite, not isolated but utterly related to each other as determinate and delimited. But they are no better off as a result of this opposing determinacy. Isolation lends them the semblance of independence, but their connection with other things, that is, with each other, expresses the fact that individual things are at the same time not independent, shows that they are conditioned and affected by other things, that they are necessary by means of other things, not by means of themselves. Thus, these necessities themselves, these laws, are what constitute the independent element. Anything that exists essentially in a nexus of connection finds its determinate character and stability not in itself but in this connection. In this, the connection upon which things are dependent. It is the connection upon which things are dependent. But these connections, when defined as causes and effects, the condition and the fact of being conditioned, etc., are themselves limited in character and are contingent in relation to each other in the sense that any of them may equally exist or not exist and may just as easily be disturbed by circumstances, that is, interrupted by contingencies or demolished in their efficacy and validity as the individual things over which they have no advantage in the matter of contingency. By contrast, those connections to which necessity must be attributed are not in any sense what we call things, but rather abstractions. If the connection of necessity manifests itself in the field of contingent things, in laws, and chiefly in relations of cause and effect, this necessity itself is something conditioned, limited, and in fact external. It is itself relegated to the category of things in respect to its isolation or externality on the one hand, and its conditionedness, limitation, and dependence on the other. In the connection of causes and effects, not only do we find the satisfaction that is lacking in the empty, unrelated isolation of things, which are just for this reason called contingent, but also the indefinite abstraction involved in the world of things. The variableness in them disappears in this relationship of necessity in which things become causes, original facts, substances that are active and indeterminate. But in the connections of this sphere, the causes themselves are finite, beginning as causes. Their being is again isolated and therefore contingent, or it is not isolated, and in that case they are effects, and therefore not independent but posited to another. The series of causes and effects are partly contingent vis-a-vis each other and partly continued in of themselves into the so-called infinite. Thus they have as their content nothing but the situations and modes of existence in which each is finite on its own account, and what ought to give stability to the connection of the series, the infinite, is not only a beyond but also a mere negative, whose very meaning is merely relative to and conditioned by what ought to be negated by it, but for this reason is not negated. So here he's playing around with the notion of absolute contingency, where he says, like, well, okay, sheer contingency doesn't really make sense. Everything contingent is actually, by its very notion, already connected, but connection is here of the necessity. The connection itself is necessary between a cause and an effect, but the connection between a cause and an effect is itself now contingent, insofar as these are finite causes and effects. Because every cause is then itself a finite thing, which is in relationship to another thing, which itself would have caused it, which itself would be caused by another cause ad infinitum. So, the cause and effect relationship, which itself appears as necessary, when not understood properly as infinite, but only as a finite cause and effect, itself is then made contingent once again. So let's see. Spirit, however, elevates itself above this mass of contingencies, above the merely external and relative necessity involved in them, above the infinite that is merely a negative, and obtains to a necessity that no longer goes beyond itself, but is in and for itself, is enclosed within itself, and is determined as complete within itself, while all other determinations are posited by it and are dependent on it. Okay, I guess that was a short one on that. But what basically comes out of this is that if you don't take it as finite, this cause or that effect, but just cause and effect as such, then the necessity really does hold. That a contingent is that which itself could or could not be. It is a finite thing, precisely because it is a finite thing, therefore it must be in relationship to another finite thing upon which it is contingent. But this relationship of a contingent to a contingent is the necessity. And therefore contingency is necessarily as contingent. The contingent contingently being is necessary. I mean, to me, that's a really simple argument. It's genius. Don't know how much else you could have possibly explained that, because it's pretty straightforward. Let's see. Where does this go? A few other things. Let's see. This seems to continue the train of thought. Thus, the thoughts that have already been indicated consist firstly of the following main aspects: a thing or law, etc., is contingent in virtue of its isolation. Whether it exists or not does not disturb or alter other things. The fact that it is so little sustained by them and that any stability it derives from them is wholly insufficient gives to them the insufficient show of independence that precisely constitutes their contingency. By contrast, the necessity of an existing thing requires that it stand in some connection with other things, such that, regarded in any of its aspects, it is seen to be completely determined by other existing things that function as conditions and causes. It cannot be separated from them or come into being on its own, nor can there be any condition, cause, or circumstance of connection by means of which it could be so separated, nor any such circumstance that could contradict the one that determines it. In accord with this specification, we place the contingency of a thing in its isolation, in the lack of a complete connection with other things. This is the first point. All right, so then that's a different point that is nonetheless like really interesting and important to this. So even if you don't immediately jump to the reflexive infinite necessity of just contingency as such, the fact that the contingent is precisely that which is merely possible that could be or could not be, and that what dictates whether it is or is not is its connection to another thing, and its connection to another thing is necessary by the fact that in it being contingent, it is this thing abstracted, and in being abstracted, it is finite, and the finite connects to the finite, and therefore the contingency is just the immediacy of things. But the contingent thing itself, in its very notion, its very meaning, if you understand what the contingent is, immediately connects it to something else, and it is that connection which brings necessity to in the finite terms of things. I mean, this is a pretty ingenious insight. I don't think I'd ever encountered this before Hegel. Before I
Neither.
encountered it. Well, before I read this, because it's pretty ingenious. Like even if you go by the finite route and you say, okay, well, there are no infinite causes. He says, well, the contingency will lead you to necessity by necessity. That insofar it's contingent, it's possible. But it's a finite thing. In order to be possible, to be abstracted, in order for that to be a finite thing, it's got to be in relation to another finite thing. This is the connection of causality, and indeed, this is precisely what we understand in everyday terms to be necessity. That necessity is connectionality, and so therefore, things are necessary in connection to other things. And what contingency comes to be is an artifact of the ignorance of the connection of things. Which is a Spinozan argument. Which is why you can strangely have a view that is, quote unquote, absolutely contingent or absolutely indeterministic, which will look no different whatsoever than the most hardcore determinism. Let's see, continuing. Conversely, however, since an existing thing stands in a condition of complete connection, it is in all aspects condition independent and thus complete, lacking in independence. In necessity alone, rather, do we find the independence of a thing. What is necessary must be. Its having to be expresses its independence in such a way that what is necessary is because it is. This is the other point. And indeed, this is where the cosmological argument usually hits a wall with the explanation of that which is necessary in and of itself. Because we understand finite necessity. We understand, okay, fine, there's a contingent thing that requires another thing to actuate it. And, virtually everyone is normally going to actually see this point. Atheists and theists alike initially, because it's just it's pretty obvious that, okay, fine, and finite things in the world are all contingent, they are conditioned by other things. We can give that. It's the point of the absolutely necessary thing, which is necessary in and of itself, in which we say, and because in the cosmological argument, it goes this way, that there's a contingent on the one side, and then there's the absolutely necessary on the other, where the absolute necessary does not have really any essential connection to the contingent, but the contingent has a connection to that absolute necessity as its ground. And so the connection is not two-way, it's only one directional. And then, that's why people have this issue of like, well, if there is an absolutely necessary thing, why can't there be an endless chain? What makes it absolutely necessary? Because it's necessity here, as Hegel says, it would be necessary. What is necessary about it is just because it is. There's no other way, in the usual way of thinking, around this. That's the imminent conclusion, that what is necessary really is just because it is. There is no further cause, there's no further condition that would give it any further reason. Which is also why in a lot of these, God becomes an inscrutable point. We just say, well, God is a necessary thing, and that is that. Why? Because it is. So let's see, in terms of the first way of representing things, everything is found in orderly connection. The contingent is different from necessary and points to a necessity, which, however, when more closely examined itself, falls back under contingency just because, being posited by another, it is dependent. But when it is removed from such a connection, it is isolated and at once immediately contingent. The intended distinctions are thus only imagined. Since it is not our intention to examine further the nature of these thoughts, and since we wish for the time being to set aside the opposition of necessity and contingency and remain with the first, we shall confine ourselves to what is suggested by our representation, that neither of the determinate qualities alone is sufficient for necessity. Rather, both are required in dependence, so that the necessity is not mediated by an other, but just as much the mediation of necessity with the other. Thus, independence and mediation contradict each other, but since at the same time they belong to the one necessity, they must not contradict each other in the unity by which they are united in it. So this leads to a concept which is pretty quick, which he calls absolute necessity. So we go from the finite form of necessity, which is a cause and an effect, to just the categorical relation itself of cause and effect. That a cause is a cause insofar as it is the condition which conditions the effect, which is the conditioned. But for a cause to be a cause, it must produce an effect. If there is no effect, then it's not a cause. But a cause is that which conditions. So if the effect itself now is a condition for the cause to be a cause, then the whole thing reverses. The cause becomes an effect of the effect, and the effect is a cause of the cause. And we've already seen that how contingency and necessity become each other. And likewise, we see how cause and effect themselves become each other. Then Hegel just goes ahead and says, like, well, once you get this circuit of meaning, we understand that actually this is one great absolute necessity, and that's what he calls it in this one. He calls it absolute necessity. I think in the science of logic, he uses a different term name, but it's basically saying the exact same thing. It's the famous self-cause, the causa sui. And so, what did this have to do with the cosmological argument? The issue with the cosmological argument is that we don't get an immanent connection for why necessity and contingency would really be tied in the first place. Given the established meanings, yes, it's obvious that there's a connection, but it's not obvious why there's a necessary connection. This leads to other problems. Hegel actually critiques quite a few of these. Particularly, he critiques, if I remember correctly, he spends a lot of time critiquing Kant and critiquing Jacobi as to what the problem this is. Let's see. Because part of this is like a long drawn out discussion about like how how it is that we come up with the problem in the first place. We come up with the problem with like, well, we observe that everything in the world is contingent. It could be or could not be. It seems conditioned by something else. And there's an elevation from this notion of contingency to necessity. And then we see, well, there's got to be something necessary. Therefore, God. But I want to see where he says specifically certain people. Let's see, maybe it goes into it. So he says, now if we look more closely at the setting for the inner course, followed by spirit and thought, and to the moments of thought, we already have noted that the initial starting point represents a category of thought, namely that of the contingency of worldly things. Accordingly, the first form of elevation is found historically in the so-called cosmological proofs of the existence of God. We have also pointed out that the specificity of the goal to which we elevate ourselves depends on the specificity of the starting point. Worldly things might be defined another way, and in that case the result or the truth would have a different specification. We might have differences that would appear unimportant to less cultivated thought, but in the sphere of thought we presently occupy are the very thing with which we are concerned and of which we must give an account. Thus, if things were to be defined into general ways of existing, it could be shown that the truth of existence as determinate being is being itself, indeterminate, limitless being. God would thus be defined simply as being the most abstract definition with which, as is well known, the Eleatics started. All right. Maybe it's the next chapter. No, it's not this one. Oh, well, I mean, it was just looking for some interesting historical things, because it particularly brings some stuff up about Jacobi and Kant. But I cannot easily find that. So let's go to Teleological Proof, which is the most infamous of the current proofs, which is everybody's least favorite proof. But if I remember correctly, Hegel doesn't think it's really any worse than the other two. Well, it's worse than the ontological proof, and so is the cosmological proof worse than the ontological, but he doesn't seem to think it's really that much worse than the cosmological, despite the fact that the cosmological, I mean, is the one that he focuses on the most, probably because, well, at the time it was the most, thought to be the most valid of them all. See, Kant already criticized this proof too, like the other proofs of God's existence, and he has in large measure destroyed the reputation, so that it is now hardly considered worthwhile to examine the proofs themselves at all carefully. Yet Kant himself says of this proof that it deserves at all times to be treated with respect, when he adds that the teleological proof is the oldest. However, he is mistaken. The first definition of God is that God is power. It is only later that God is defined as wisdom. Moreover, this proof first occurs among the Greeks. It was formulated by Socrates in Xenophon, Memorabilia, and of Book 1. Socrates makes purposiveness, especially in the form of the good, the basic principle of reason. The reason for his imprisonment is, according to him, that the Athenians have deemed it good. Even historically, therefore, this proof coincides with the development of freedom. We have already considered the transition from the religion of power to the religion of spirituality in general. The same mediating process that we recognize in the religion of beauty, we have also encountered already in the intermediate stages, but in these stages, it is still interpreted in a manner devoid of spirit. Now, this transition to the religion of spirituality has introduced a further essential determination we must first identify and demonstrate in an abstract fashion. So I completely forgot about that. His view of the teleological proof is like way more detailed than any standard form I've ever seen of this. I mean, the fact that he already just brings up this distinction between power and wisdom, and like where this comes from in our everyday notions of religion. that in order to get to the teleological proof, you have to have a notion of wisdom, a notion of the good, of ends, which is indeed a far more complex concept than the notions of causality, which the cosmological proof rests on.
Kant's moral argument for God is actually really interesting. It's especially interesting to discuss with philosophers too, because they don't seem to grasp the import of like denying it. Where the idea is that in order for our moral will, for the good to be realizable in the world, nature itself must be conducive to the good, and therefore there should be an identity through which they are able to be commensurate. And where people think that if people deny this means that it doesn't make sense to do anything moral because nature itself is constructed so that it's not realizable. Nature, under Kant's argument, has to be constructed such that it's conducive towards the good being realized, and so that your moral will could actually attain in the world.
Huh. I had never thought about that. You're right.
Yeah, and so
and that is a form of the
you deny
teleological
that.
proof.
You're basically
Yeah, that
saying
is.
morality is worthless. You have to believe that nature is such that goodness, moral will is realizable in and through it, and it is designed basically to be realizable in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I knew this was his argument. I had just it never crossed my mind that this is itself a form of the teleological proof. Interesting. And yeah, you're right. It makes perfect sense that. And I mean, Kant doesn't think that this is a knockdown proof. He thinks it's only.
You think it's
that's
a postulate?
Yeah, he thinks it's a postulate. We have to assume this. It's an ideal of it's an ideal of reason. If we didn't assume this, indeed, action would just be impossible. Not because of our assumption, but because if we didn't assume this, we just wouldn't act in the first place. I mean, if you don't have faith that what you do is going to be any good, you're not going to do anything.
Yeah.
And indeed, so God being
It makes sense for you to do anything. It'd be irrational to try and do it.
Yeah, God being wisdom and the good, which realizes itself in the world. If you don't believe that this is an actual reality, then yeah, it's pointless, it's hopeless. And then your own belief in goodness itself becomes pointless. And like you could start getting arguments for like, well, then you really shouldn't be depressed about anything. Why did you even believe this? There's no such thing as the good. Stuff just happens.
Yeah, I think the basic idea is a lot of people who get, because again, a lot of philosophers don't accept or don't find arguments like that personally challenging, or it's because they're not identified with their thinking. Basically, they don't think that there's a connection between the things they believe, like that, or that they think they have to think, and how they should really understand their lives. For them, it's basically philosophy is treated as like in one box over here, and then life is in another box. And so they, like somebody who takes that really seriously, who really seriously denied, say, Kant's postulate there, you should be absolutely horrified at existence and like being alive and stuff like that. It'd be so irrational. There'd be no sense to any suffering or anything it would be so incoherent to exist and to be living and doing things. But only people who take philosophy really seriously, whose mind and will and sense of the world is wedded together, can actually be disturbed by arguments like that. Like, you have to be able to be disturbed in order to do philosophy. By philosophy, you have to allow it to affect you.
Yeah, fully agree on that. Oh man, I had something in my mind regarding this, and then it just slipped. Oh. Yes. I mean, like I said, like for example, the whole thing of we just finished here reading of the cosmological proof of contingency, necessity. That's Hegel's own version of a quote-unquote cosmological proof, but this is still not yet as far as Hegel cares, it's not yet a proof of God, because God is so much more than just causality, necessity. Likewise, Hegel also has his own form of this, of the teleological proof. What Kant says is very much true. It's just not true enough. In the Science of Logic, Hegel has, as the penultimate chapters, is the chapter on the theoretical and the practical idea. The theoretical idea is the idea of the receptivity of cognition, in which cognition is made true by conforming itself to the object. And the practical idea is the idea of the good, because the idea of the good is the inverse of the theoretical, where the theoretical is the cognition is made true by the object. In the practical idea, in the good, the object is made true by cognition, working on it. And Hegel has, Hegel, like this is one of those things, going back to the very beginning where we started about this whole idea that, God isn't, there is, that the idea, atheist readings of Hegelianism. Hegel has quite a few passages which are just bombshells, in which he says, any of you who think that saving the world is upon your shoulders is a fool and has no faith. You're a fool because if you understood the truth, you would have the faith. That the good is always already present and in progress. If you fail, don't worry. The world literally does not end. Maybe the planet may end. We may nuke ourselves. That's okay. That's the process of reality, the process of the good, the process of freedom coming to be goes on. It does not end with any singular finite thing. And that's Hegel's own proof, in which he secures what Kant only says can be merely an ideal of reason. Kant says, well, we can't know this is true, but we must believe it is true. Otherwise, we'd just be despaired and we wouldn't do anything. And Hegel says, well, we can know that it's true just through the sheer nature of what it would mean to be absolute, or rather what it means to be absolute in the end. That if we understand what it is to be in the fullest sense of it, we understand that this is a self-relating system of reality in which, on the grand scale of things, the fact that we're here, the fact that we didn't have to even, we didn't conceive ourselves into existence, as finite individuals, at least in the typical sense, never mind some supernatural beliefs people have and reports from trips and near-death experiences. But on a natural level, we didn't bring ourselves into existence. Our consciousness, our finite consciousness, did not bring itself into existence. Nonetheless, there was a universal process going on in which the conditions have been so guided, not from outside, but from within themselves. Just like a plant doesn't, you don't have to teach a plant how to grow. The plant just grows and matures and does these things. Nature is also growing living conscious beings all over the place, in its infinity. It goes on forever. Probably is more common than we think, or even if it's not as common as we think, it doesn't matter. An infinity is still an infinity. We're not the only ones, and we're not the only ones in this place at this one time. So anyways, where was I going with that? Oh yeah, well that's basically his teleological proof, that the good has always been, is ever present. It's not subject to relying on a singular contingent will of us human beings to make sure that the good comes through. I mean, certainly our willing and our activities are part of it, but it does not rest on any singular shoulder. This is why Hegel says, the whole thing about the repetition of history. What is it that there's that famous Marx quote that first is a tragedy, second is a farce. He says, hey, no, he says that Hegel says that somewhere. Hegel doesn't. What Hegel does actually say, I think, if I remember correctly, is particularly in the philosophy of history, where he mentions that world events happen at least 2 times. The first time it happens and it fails, you might brush it off then. It's only happened once. You could say, well, that was just a contingent thing. If it happens twice or more times, then whatever is happening by a necessity. Something's going on that is producing this movement again and again, and this movement will break through eventually. Whether it is because the current state of affairs of its own is going to die and just yield to this new state of affairs, which is more vital, has more spiritual life in it, or because its contradictions will just cause it to implode anyways, in a what Marx calls the general ruination of the classes. Either way, one person arising, seeming to carry the hopes of everybody on their shoulders and failing is not the end of the world. Historically, that has not been the case, and I don't really see how it would be the case any time in the future either. So, people like us may be disappointed that our current leaders, are pretty pathetic and stupid, and there's a person there who's actually got some kind of moral backbone, knows something about what's going on, and you'd be like, oh, it'd be so great if they got into power. Maybe you like Bernie Sanders, for 2016, I did. And you get to the point, and it seems you're so close, and you feel robbed, and you may have been robbed. Either way, it doesn't matter. The fact that this happened may be a contingency. If it keeps happening, it'll be saying something.
Wait, Bernie isn't president in your reality?
I don't know. Would it be any different if he was president? So part of me thinks,
Well, yeah,
not really.
By definition.
And even if
But
we
no.
were the only life in the universe, like it only was on Earth, it will come back. Or it will, for Hegel, nature ontologically is just the coming to be of spirit. That's all it does. It doesn't do anything else. So it doesn't matter if it only happened here. Planet gets wiped out. It's going to happen again somehow. There's nothing else for nature to do. No other direction for it to go.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, Hyperion, what's the ontological existence for the argument for Bernie Sanders?
None.
I'll tell you later.
Anyways, yeah, you're right, Rain. That's part of Hegel's thing. Hegel's thing is people like Zizek do say this. Actually, Zizek kind of doesn't say this. Other people say it as an attack against Hegelianism. Oh, Hegelianism is a philosophy of reconciliation. Just accept what's going on, man. That don't do anything. Well, no, that's not what it means. But reconciliation is also really a reconciliation to understand, look, things are going as they're going. There is a broader reason for it. Whether we can attain to that reason is a completely different thing. We ought to strive for it. Just like we, in our own personal lives, we ought to strive to the highest ideals of who we are. Do we always achieve that? No. Whether it be for problems of our own will or whether it be for problems from the outside conditions of the world. Nonetheless, in our daily living, day-to-day life, throughout our lives, there is a general trend towards which we can maintain, for the most part, a level of control and self-determination. Likewise, if an asteroid hits us, next month or whatever, it would be contingency. It wouldn't be that, you wouldn't necessarily have to assume, this was some kind of fated thing, planned by God. God decides, well, so many years, we're just going to nuke humanity again. You don't have to go that far. You don't have to say, oh, well, it wasn't meant to be. No, not necessarily. But even life ended all over this planet. It literally has ended before at least 2 times, and it's always come back. And it's come back in ways that we don't even fucking understand. We don't understand how fast life redevelops. It's crazy. We have this one thing like called the Cambrian explosion, where like in a couple million years we have a ridiculous diversity of developed life forms, which basically, in the temporal sense, seem to come out of fucking nowhere. Just this explosion of diversity and complexification of life that, before that it was like, billions and billions of years before life redeveloped. And yet, we have these catastrophic world events that kill off virtually all life, except, for some microbes. And what's left, like, quickly redevelops. So, yeah, anybody who's worried, like, oh, well, all the goodness in the world is gone because humanity is dead and the current species on the world are dead, that's really nothing to worry about for the Hegelian. It's a blip in existence, quite literally. I mean, if the fear is like, oh, well, it's going to take, 10 billion years for it to come by again, doesn't matter. Time is nothing. Time matters for us who live and experience time. Time doesn't matter for the planet. 10 billion years for the Earth is a moment. It's not consciously waiting around. But maybe
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Hyperion.
Oh, I just said here.
yeah. Maybe a lot of the people listening would find that morbid or something, but I don't know. Seems fine to me.
It's also it's like every aspect of the process has infinite value. Like nothing's like wasted, so to speak. Like, I don't know.
Are you saying nothing lasts but nothing is lost?
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it.
Terence McKenna's famous dictum?
Yeah, basically.
Like it's like worrying that you're gonna that it mattering was something that had to come about, whereas it matters now.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Great point. Perfect point. I think that's the main gist of the good for Hegel. Hegel actually warns about this. He says, "Don't live for the future. That's stupid. The future, as far as you're concerned, may or may not come. Many things may or may not come. Eternity is now. Hegel is a Christian. Nonetheless, interestingly, Hegel does not believe in the afterlife, quote unquote. He actually has arguments, which he says it's just plain stupid to believe in it, because it wouldn't make sense as far as he's concerned. That insofar as we really are spirit, we really understand that we are. We realize that indeed we are God manifest here and now. We ourselves as finite beings are not God, the totality. But we are concretizations of God. We at least have the divine mind of thought. We can conceive divinely, as opposed to, we cannot create nature out of our mere thoughts like God can, but we can at least conceive and understand divinely. All these things are, in and of themselves, perfectly good as they are. The animals and the trees and the rocks are perfectly good in and as they are. They are lacking nothing from God's point of view. And likewise, we lack nothing from our point of view, and we should not view that we lack anything. That as imperfect as things seem, this is itself the way goodness and perfection looks like. If you think that goodness is a utopia where people are always happy and there are no problems, well, Hegel has some bad news for you. Because for Hegel, that's not really what goodness is about. Goodness is also the process of the becoming of goodness, which also involves the whole issues of people coming to be in a world in which they are given nothing. They're not given the proper things of how to self-determine. They have to figure things out, and then because you have to figure things out, and we have to figure things out every generation. Not from scratch, because the good thing about generations is we have prior generations which can teach us. But each generation has to verify for itself the truth anew, and they come into their own context, and they see things in a new way, in which is part of why, by the way, it's so good that there is always a fresh new generation with fresh new perspectives. People who want to live forever are going to ruin our society, I guarantee it. The day that you can have presidents that live forever is going to be a terrible thing for everybody. Because we do need that fresh perspective. We are finite beings. We reach a point in which, regardless of how much we think we're good, how much we think we're wise, we're not. We're not wiser than reality in the end. Even the wisest, most enlightened man like Ramana Maharshi is not someone you can listen to forever. They don't have the answers to everything, even if they have all the computation, power in the world, all the access to the facts, and spend the time to read all these things and advise you. They can't ultimately do it. Fresh perspectives are always required, so it's damn good that old people fucking die.
I was reading an article that what was the title of it? I think it was Society Changes Its Mind Faster Than People Do. And the idea was that generational turnover is mostly where societal change, or a big part of where societal change comes from. Because if you follow a person throughout their life, their views will basically change slower on average than societies as a whole will. And regarding the, or just a side note regarding the stuff, it's like people and the world and stuff is self-determination in the process of determining itself. And people, part of their self-determination is that they have to come about to an awareness of themselves as self-determining. But that process itself is self-determining. It's just not aware of itself as such, strictly speaking. And so the infinite value in it is in its very nature, in its very kernel of what it does, irrespective of if it fucks it up or if it succeeds.
The process and the end are one and the same. The end is being realized as the process is being realized. So there's no direction between I have to wait to be free. No, that my own seeking of freedom is already me being free. And that's why, for Hegel, there is no point in thinking that I have to make the world good. The world is good. The fact that I'm thinking of making the world good is itself already the process of good itself. The good is present. And even if I fail, even if I have these grandiose plans to help people and save the planet, maybe I succeed, maybe I don't. Even if I fail, that itself, as you said, is infinitely worthy. It's infinitely valuable. It is itself a reality of freedom. And that's Hegel's own form of the teleological argument, that the good is always ever present, that the very process of seeking the good is already the good itself, that the conditions which allow you to seek the good, even in a terrible world, you can hate the current world as much as you like, it's built on genocide, it's built on, so many people, blood and bones, oppression, all these things, even especially, if you're oppressed, if you're one of those people in marginalized groups, and I mean the marginalized groups is a false way to put it, because these marginalized groups tend to be actually the majority of the world. Even if you're in the situations, this discomfort, this despair you feel is itself the reality, what freedom feels like in that condition, where you're having that that capacity to be faced with this and to struggle against it, because the struggle itself is a struggle imminent to freedom itself, and freedom is the end of everything for Hegel. Freedom is the purpose. And actually, Hegel's whole critique of the teleological proof is simply that, as it is basically put in the usual way, there's the good over here, and then there's reality. Or rather, there's purpose, and there's being. And goodness, purpose, has to come and force being to be good, force being to be true. And Hegel says, well, so long as we have this notion, this is just a finite view. This is not only not convincing in the usual way. The main teleological proof people know about is the argument from design. I think the main one that people know about today is particularly the fine-tuning argument, in which people's like, oh, but the universe is so perfect. It's got to be designed. It's got to have a wisdom behind it. Therefore there must be God, which is not a very convincing argument by regular standards. It's not that much more convincing, really, when you think about it theologically either. This argument from the good, like Kant's argument, is way better. Socrates' view of the good is way better, a way better view of this as well. And Hegel's is definitely an intensification and clarification and the true form of these arguments, where the good cannot be this thing imposed from without. It has to be from within. And Hegel particularly makes the argument that as far as design goes, as far as purpose goes, the proof of goodness, of the truth of the teleological argument, is life itself. That living beings are the proof. That the way we see living beings operate as having an internal purposiveness, where they generate themselves, out of undead matter, as far as we can tell. Not that we just have masses of unorganized dead matter that spontaneously gets organized into living stuff. We've tried that so many times, but we can't get it going yet, despite that being the hypothesis. So somehow some process allows life to emerge out of some configuration of matter where the whatever life as a phenomenon is, which seems to be some kind of higher forms of electromagnetism and a whole bunch of other things. Whatever kickstarts that reaction and self-reflexivity of material chemical reactions, once it gets going, and it does not stop. And it has its own ways of operating, which are not merely chemical, not merely physical, mechanical. It starts having these things of homeostasis, and it starts actively maintaining homeostasis as opposed to passively doing so. Then homeostasis leads to these necessities of somehow minds emerge, somehow subjectivity emerges, and these things have drives, hunger, all these other things, and then that gets integrated into this whole thing, and then it just develops more and more and more. But the key term of that is that internal purposiveness of which life is on the most basic level.
Yeah, the way I interpret, like you mentioned, whatever happens kickstarts this thing that takes off on its own. I look at it in the reverse, where it is the nature of life itself posits the finitude of the chemical and mechanical and so on in nature. And so it's the chemical and mechanical appearing independently and in its extrinsicality and stuff like that is the self-forming of life implicit but not yet explicit. And so, whenever that first cell would have formed or something like that, it was because it was in the nature of life through which those things that existed in the first place that it is able to bring together and self-contain some the happenstance of the whatever chemical soup you had at some primordial time. So it's basically like life is already just implicit. It's just not brought itself forth within its own thing that is posited, which is natural world.
Yeah. In these lectures, there is a passage where Hegel mentions specifically this. He says, like, if in case you're thinking that I'm saying that life just contingently arises in the universe, happenstance, he says, no, I'm not. He says life is necessary.
Yeah, and I think this is really interesting because it means all conception is immaculate. Like the first cell forming was an immaculate conception. Even like something becoming pregnant now or something like that. The sperm and the egg don't make the zygote. The zygote is what unifies those things and forms itself from them. Other way around, right? Like, of course,
Mm-hmm.
mom and dad had to make an egg and a sperm and stuff like that. But that the egg and the sperm forms the zygote is the zygote's doing. It's just not apparent. Like, it's just because it's not visibly, you don't like see the zygote before it's made, right? But it operates from the zygote through those.
Yeah, that it's logically the inverse of what people normally think. And despite the fact that, yes, I know it sounds insane just when you say it, if you guys took the time, for those of you listening, to understand this, it makes more sense than anything else you have ever heard.
Yeah, that's the funny thing. It's totally just like intelligible that it works that way. It doesn't make sense for it not to actually at all. But you do have to work through it. It's the way you're taught to think is not going to be overly amenable to being able to see things flip around like that. Hegel has some nice comments on nature in the introduction about it being what is it, evolution and a convolution simultaneously, where like it backwardly posits it like its evolutionary path, like as a whole nature, and at the same time as positing that backwards path is the very same thing that's bringing about. Yeah, it's like it's bringing itself as about from the future, but the future is the positing of its past, sort of. And so like the present activity is just so there is an evolutionary element, but it's also again, evolution and emanation are both for Hegel abstract.
Yeah, actually, okay, I think I found the long passage going over this exact issue of like what comes first, life or the things of matter. He says, the conditions involved in this relationship are not developed by the living thing itself, the organic nature. Yet if it did not find them already present, it could not exist. The consideration of this immediacy brings with it the feeling of something higher, something that has established this harmony, and this at once arouses human emotion and wonder too. Every animal has its own small range of foodstuffs. Indeed, many animals are restricted to a single food. This is another respect in which human nature is the most general. The fact that this external, quite peculiar condition holds for every animal arouses humanity to an astonishment that passes over into a high veneration for that third being, in addition to nature and the human subject, which has posited this unity. This reverent wonder is the elevation of humanity to the higher being that brings forth the necessary conditions for its own purpose. The subject is actively concerned with its own preservation. This active concern is present, though unconsciously, in every living thing. It is what we call instinct in the animal. One animal secures its own maintenance by violence, another produces it by ingenuity. This is the wisdom of God in nature, in which this infinite multiplicity of activities and conditions necessary for particular forms is encountered. When we consider the particular ways in which living beings are active, we see that they are something contingent. They are not posited by the subject itself, but require an external cause. In the life principle, only the general principle of self-preservation is posited, but living beings differ in an infinitude of particular ways, and this particular variety is posited by another. But the question is this: how is organic nature adapted to how is inorganic nature adapted to the organic? How does it come to be capable of serving as a means for organic life? Here we encounter a view of the matter that grasps this coincidence in a distinctive fashion. Animals are inorganic vis-a-vis human beings, and plants are inorganic vis-a-vis animals. But the nature that is inorganic in itself, such as the sun, moon, and whatever appears as a means or as a matter generally, is initially immediate
It is already there before the organic. Consequently, the relationship is so constituted that the inorganic is independent, while the organic, by contrast, is what is dependent. The inorganic, which is here termed the immediate, is the unconditioned. Inorganic nature appears as self-sufficient. Plants, animals, and humans are added to it afterward from outside. The earth could subsist without vegetation, the vegetable kingdom without animals, and the animal kingdom without humans. Hence, these different aspects appear to be independent of one another. We appeal to experience in support of this too. There are mountains without any vegetation and without animal or human life. The moon has no atmosphere. There is on it no meteorological process, such as provides the necessary conditions for vegetation, so it subsists without any vegetation. And there are other similar examples. Something inorganic of this kind appears to be self-subsistent. Humanity is an extraneous addition to it. So we come to the view that nature is inwardly a productive power that produces blindly, from which issues forth vegetation. Out of vegetation there springs the animal world, and at last all of humanity with its thinking consciousness. In any case, we can say that nature produces stages, among which each one is always the condition for the next one. But if organic life and humanity are contingent accretions of this kind, the question that arises is whether human beings will or will not find what is necessary there ready for them. According to this view, this will likewise be a matter of chance, since on this view there is no unity that is valid on its own account. Aristotle already suggests the same opinion. Nature produces living beings continually, and the question then is whether they can exist. Whether one of them can maintain itself is wholly a matter of chance. Thus nature has already conducted an infinite number of experiments and has produced a whole host of monsters. Many myriads of configurations have emerged from it, but they were not able to survive. Their disappearance, however, was of no importance. As evidence to prove this assertion, we are referred especially to the remains of monsters that are still to be found here and there. These genera perished, so it is assumed, because the conditions necessary for their existence had ceased to obtain. In this way, the concordance of the organic and the inorganic is established as contingent. There is no need to ask for a unity, and the very fact of purposiveness is explained as contingent. The conceptual determinations involved here, therefore, are the following. Speaking generally, what we call inorganic nature, as such, is represented on its own account as self-subsistent, while the organic is represented as an external accretion, so that it is a matter of chance whether it finds, in what stands over against it, the necessary conditions for its existence. We must take note here of the form of the conceptual determination. Inorganic nature is what is first and immediate. It also matches the childlike sense of the Mosaic age, that heaven and earth, light, etc., were created first and the organic emerged later in time. The question is whether this is the authentic way of defining the concept of the inorganic, and whether living beings and humanity are what is dependent. Against this view, philosophy exhibits the truth involved in the determination of the concept, but even without that, human beings are in no doubt that they are actively related to the rest of nature as its end or purpose, and that nature has only the role of means vis-a-vis humanity, for this is the role of the inorganic generally vis-a-vis the organic. In formal terms, the organic is in itself what is purposive. It is both means and end, and so it is implicitly something infinite. It is purpose returning into itself, and even on the side of its external dependence, it is defined as purpose. Therefore, it is what is genuinely first as against what has been termed the immediate, that is, as against nature. This immediacy is only a one-sided determination, must be downgraded to being only something positive. The genuine relationship is this. Humanity is not an accidental accretion upon what comes first. On the contrary, what comes first is, for the organic, itself, and the inorganic has only the semblance of being in regard to it. This relationship is logically developed in science itself. All right, so that's the basic thing about life posits nature as the whole bodies of physical matter and gravity and all the forces to give itself a body. Indeed, this does not seem believable in abstraction, but trust me, it makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense.
I'm interested in the stuff that comes after this. Like,
all right, let's see. So he says, But in this relationship, we still have separation. The fact that the organic involves, on one side, the external relatedness to an organic nature, instead of inorganic nature being posited implicitly in the organic itself. The living being develops from the seed, and development is the action of the members, the inner organs. The soul is a unity that brings forth this action. Here, too, however, the truth of organic and inorganic nature is only the essential connection between the two, their unity, inseparability. This unity is a third term, which is neither the one nor the other, and the absolute category that unites the organic and the inorganic is not to be found in immediate existence. The subject is what is organic, and the other term appears as an object. But then it changes into the predicate of the organic and becomes posited as belonging to it. This is the reciprocity of this connection. The two terms are posited in one, within which each of them is something dependent and conditioned. In general terms, we can call this third term, to which consciousness raises itself, God. But a great deal is still lacking from the concept of God. God is in this case the activity of production, which is a judgment or primal division, through which the two sides are both produced together. In this one concept, they fit together, they are for one another. We are therefore quite right in emphasizing that the truth of the purposive relation is the third term, as we have just defined it, but this only defines the third term formally. On the basis of what is the truth of. It is itself living activity, but this is still not spirit or rational action. The correspondence of the concept as the organic to reality, as the inorganic is nothing, but the meaning of life itself. More specifically, this is what the ancients called, I think that should be nous. The world is a harmonic whole, an organic life that is determined according to purposes. This was what the ancients understood by something else. Something else Greek. Another way of defining it as the world's soul, or something else Greek. All that is posited by this is vitality, or the life principle. It is not yet posited that the world's soul is distinct from its life principle as spirit. The soul is the life principle in the organic, and no more. It is not something sundered from the body, something material, but is a life force that permeates the body. For this reason, Plato called God an immortal, that is an eternally living principle. He did not get beyond this category of life principle. When we grasp the life principle in its truth, we find that it is one principle, one organic life of the universe, one living system. Everything that is constitutes the organs of the one subject. The planets that revolve around the sun are only giant members of this one system. Thus, the universe is not an aggregate made up of many mutually indifferent accidents, but a system based on the principle of life. This account, however, still does not involve the positing of the category of spirit. Yeah, this goes on for quite a bit. But we already get the general gist of this. And especially here, if anybody thinks that what we were talking about earlier, that life is what posits nature as time and space and all the things that go in it, that you're thinking that some kind of some little bacteria is the one doing this. No. The universe itself, Hegel says, is one living system. Just like the organelles within your cells are themselves, parts of a living system, but not themselves alive. Your RNA is not alive, or DNA as well are not alive. The moment you take that out of the living cell, that's just inorganic matter. Stuff like mitochondria. Well, actually, no, mitochondria is itself a sub-living thing, a subcell in the cell. I forget what the heck is called. These other things like ribosomes. Nah, it's not ribosomes. Ribosomes is one thing, but I forget what they are. There's these bunch of organelles which themselves mechanically do things within cells, but themselves are not alive. Same thing with the rest of the universe. Suns, stars, planets, asteroids, all these things are like organelles in the entire living system of the world. This doesn't mean that the universe as a whole can be thought of as being one giant amoeba of sorts. no, like if you're going to think about it, it's the movement is rather than scaling up and like that on the scaling up you see the living thing, where the organs are within the thing. It's sort of reversed because these are organs outside the living thing. That when we can literally see it as stars, planets, and all these things develop as preconditional organs for the arising of bacteria and amoebas, and then higher eukaryotes and whatnot, a higher level of multicellular beings, and then conscious beings, plants, all these other things. Technically speaking, it makes a lot of sense to just say, oh yeah, suns and earths and moons are organs. They're inorganic organs of living things.
There's one brief quote from the Philosophy of Nature. I'm just going to read quick here. It is first in the animal organism that the differences of shape are so developed as to exist essentially only as its members, thereby constituting its subject. Vitality, as natural, falls apart into the indeterminate plurality of living things, which, however, are in themselves subjective organisms, and it is only in the idea that they are one life, one organic system of life.
Yep. Because the universe is alive insofar as the universe is the idea of life, we could say. And by this, already the universe transcends itself away from merely being a spatial, temporal, mechanical thing. Life is a whole different way of determining things. But in just being the idea of life, if you, as a mere totality, it technically does not exist because it's not an object that on the level of material existence has a boundary. But individual living things within the system are the existence of that process of life. So, if one asks, well, where does life come from? Is there a force, universal force of life? The answer is yes, life comes from the fact that there is a universal force of life in the universe as a whole, which is the force which also is manifesting as gravity, is manifesting as electricity, is manifesting as chemical forces and relationships, and all these other things. Because life is not a physical, material phenomenon first and primarily. For Hegel, life is truly metaphysical. Life is even a logical aspect, a determination of reality. Even if there is no space and time, there still is life, because God is a life, or rather, God is living. God is life itself. Logic and thought are life. There's the way they are. The way they are is an animated existence. It's the way to put it. Again, a pretty odd view from the regular view of things, but makes perfect sense once you get it. But yeah, that's Hegel's own version of the teleological argument. So yeah, I think that's generally all I kind of wanted to cover with this. We went to the cosmological, teleological, the ontological proof was the first one we went over. You would think that it'd be like the one that Hegel talks about the most, but it's not, because it's the one he talks about the least. There's really not much to say about it. I mean, the argument itself is pretty simple. The problems with it are like simpler than the other ones, and the solution to it is the most complex out of them all. So yeah, unfortunately, I don't know why. Maybe it's just because like I'm streaming, it's on streamer mode or something, that I couldn't find all these quotes that you had, Rain, because they were really great.
We can make an addendum later.
Yeah, apparently it's because I was in streamer mode. Let me see if I can find some now. That's a pretty stupid feature.
Yeah.
It's the best of all possible features.
Let's see.
At some point, we're going to have to field questions from people.
They can ask all they want.
Yeah, but one day we're going to have to answer.
Like Hegel, I will answer what I want to answer. And I like his response of, if you come at me with like, well, I don't agree that God is that, well, I don't care.
Yeah, I don't care. But we know what they want with regards to that.
Yeah, well, if they can't tell me the movement from being to nothing and becoming, I got no time for people like that. Let's see, yeah, and somewhere else. Where is this? Ah, yes, I found. There's that one quote from the subjective mind thing that I was looking for earlier. But you already read that one, Rain. The one about how we should not mistake finite mind and which is only representational, only cannot posit the world actually, but with God, God has to be the absolute mind, which posits nature actually, not merely hypothetically or retroactively. By the way, for all the goddamn like physics nerds that like believe that mass is God, what's wrong with you?
Is it math? Mathematics?
Yeah, math.
Yeah.
People
all
like
the Heracliteans. All the Pythagoreans.
Well, I mean, I think Pythagoras thought like math was divine, but I don't know that he thought math was God.
He thought number was God.
Like, did he? Well, I mean, what he thought number was like not really what people think numbers are now.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't think math is even coherent.
I don't think it's coherent because they're like, oh, this equation proves it, and I look at it and I'm like, what the fuck does that mean?
Yeah, it's not obvious to me that math is used consistently.
It's actually a good chunk of the lectures on the proofs of God are like an attack on the formalism of math, in which Hegel's just saying like math doesn't even have proper proofs. Like, they're also the irony of mathematics is that everyone thinks nowadays that math is the most objective science, and Hegel says, "What's wrong with you? Like, it's the most subjective science. Like, it's the one science where like things only work because you arbitrarily posit them."
Subjective and dead. Show me the proof for why a capybara wearing a lobster costume is very cute.
Oh yeah, did you see that one like tweet of that one guy's going like talking about how everything is functions? He's like,
yes,
functions describe reality.
Yeah,
This, that, functions. Their functions. You functions.
Yeah, I think cybernetics won the intellectual atmosphere of the past 100 years. Because it's pretty much the language of just like empirical sciences and mathematization and things like that.
Okay, I think I found one of the quotes I was looking for. It's the one at the end of the encyclopedia, which is talking about the the independent standing of God, which I don't know, man. I love it the way Aristotle talks about God, despite the fact that Aristotle's God is like, eh. But like, there's so many things right with what he says.
Huh.
It's downright beautiful. It is. Let me bring that up. All right, so this is literally the end of the encyclopedia, like the entire encyclopedia, where he brings this up about. No, that's not it. This one. He brings up 3 syllogisms, which are 3 ways to view the absolute. So 575. It is this appearing which initially grounds the further development. The first appearing is constituted by the syllogism that has the logical as its ground, its starting point, and nature as the middle that joins the mind together with the logical. The logical becomes nature, and nature becomes mind. Nature, which stands between the mind and its essence, does not in fact separate them into extremes of finite abstraction, nor does it separate itself from them into something independent. That as an other only joins together others, for the syllogism is determined within the idea, and nature is essentially determined only as a transit point and negative moment, and in itself the idea. But the mediation of the concept has the external form of transition, and science has the form of the progression of necessity, so that only in the one extreme is the freedom of the concept posited as its joining together with itself. So, here we begin something just merely the logical idea, then nature as the becoming, but the only true thing we get at the end in that syllogism is spirit. So 576, in the second syllogism, this appearance is ablated insofar as the syllogism is already the standpoint of the mind itself, which is the mediator of the process, presupposes nature and joins it together with the logical. It is the syllogism of spiritual reflection within the idea. Science appears as a subjective cognition, whose aim is freedom and which is itself the way to produce its freedom. All right. Then section 577, the third syllogism is the idea of philosophy, which has self-knowing reason, the absolute universal, for its middle, a middle that divides into mind and nature, making mind the presupposition, as the process of the idea's subjective activity, and nature the universal extreme, as the process of the idea that is in itself objective. The self-judging of the idea into the 2 appearances determines them as its, self-knowing reasons, manifestations, and in it a unification takes place. It is the concept, the nature of the subject matter that moves onwards and develops, and this movement is equal to the activity of cognition. The eternal idea, the idea that is in and for itself, eternally remains active, engenders, and enjoys itself as absolute mind. So there we have idea, or like logos, as the absolute middle point that splits itself into nature and into subjective mind, finite mind, or spirit. And that's the true syllogism, as opposed to the other first 2, where the first one is just logic transitioning through nature into mind, and nature itself being just a vanishing mediator. The second one being merely a reflective one, which is merely subjective. Science appears as subjective cognition, whose aim is freedom, which is itself the way to produce its freedom. So this would be kind of the reading that people have of the that Hegel's God is merely the finite state and human subject. And it's the Aristotle Metaphysics 12. This is a quote. Thinking that is in itself is of what is best in itself, and the highest thinking is of the highest object. The intellect thinks itself by communion in the thinkable, for the intellect becomes thinkable by touching and thinking. So intellect and thinkable are the same, for what is receptive of the thinkable in the essence is intellect. But when it has it, it is active. So the divine feature which the intellect seems to have is the former rather than the latter, and the contemplation is the pleasantest and best. If therefore God does as well as always, as we do sometimes, it is wonderful. But if he does better than we do, it is even more wonderful. And that is how it is. And life is present in him too, for the activity of intellect is life, but intellect is the activity, and activity that is in itself is the intellect's best and eternal life. We say that God is an eternal living being, the best. So life and unceasing and eternal duration belong to God, for this is what God is.
That's a good closing note.
Yep, I think we can leave it at that. All right. I think there were quite a few other quotes that I wanted to get to, but it's too much to be looking for them right now. Anyways, this has been a good discussion. Thanks for joining, Rain. Thanks for joining, Hyperion.
Sure.
Yeah, it's been good.
Yeah, well, we'll see if we can get... there's so much more to say about the topic of God and Hegel. We'll see if we can probably get a bit more organized next time and have more things ready, and might do another one, go into specific details that we didn't cover in this one. But for those of you listening, thanks for listening. Hope you found this educational. Remember, you can't be Hegelian if you don't believe in God.
You shouldn't want to be a Hegelian in the first place, but...
Yeah, what are you doing here? Go read Schopenhauer or something. Anyways, goodbye. See you around next time.
See ya.